Good evening. This video is about an event of huge significance in the history of Islam. Ashura. Ashura is celebrated by a number of groups within Islam, primarily within the Sunni part of the Muslim world, as the day in which Moses got out of Egypt. But for many groups, including within Sunni Muslims, but primarily Shiite Muslims, Ashura is remembering Karbala, basically remembering the killing of Al-Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad. Now that's a day of huge sadness for Shia Muslims and for many Muslims because of the dramatic, of course, for the loss, for the killing of Al-Hussein, but also for the dramatic way in which he and a number of members of the household of the Prophet were murdered by an army of the growing Islamic state at the time, the first dynasty to rule Islam, which is the Umayyads or Al-Umayyin. But this video is not really about the huge sadness and pain that is still very much remembered, not only by Shiites, particularly, of course, by Shia Muslims or Shiite Muslims, but not only by them. But apart from that, there are a number of key consequences, political consequences, that emerged out of that event, that horrendous event. First, basically about the signal that was sent by the Umayyads, Al-Umayyun, the very first dynasty to rule in the growing Islamic state at the time, the Islamic empire at the time. And that signal was, it is all about accessing, having and deploying power. Excessive use of power, tremendous use of power. This was a new message in the notion of power within Islam. Why? Because before that, whether in the election of the first caliph, the first political successor of the Prophet, Abu Bakr, or after that, Umar ibn al-Khattab, the second political successor or caliph, or Osman ibn Affan, the third, or Ali ibn Abi Talib, the fourth. And despite the fact that the second, third, and fourth were killed, despite all of that, the notion of transfer of power, political power, was very much anchored on the idea of major, wide agreement within the political and religious elite of the Muslim community on the person to be chosen, on the political successor, the caliph. In the period starting from the rule of Ali ibn Abi Talib, and for at least a decade after that, some would say 20 years, until Ashura, until Karbala, until the battle in which Al-Hussein died, for that period there were many political problems and issues and turmoil in that state. But still, in the back of people's mind, the idea of becoming a caliph, or the caliph, becoming the political successor to the Prophet, was anchored on the notion of wide agreement of the political / religious elite of the Muslim community. After Ashura, Karbala, the killing of Al-Hussein, slaughtering a large number of the members of the household of the Prophet, and the transfer, decisively the transfer of the caliphate to the Al-Umayyin, the Umayyads, the first dynasty in Islam, here, transfer of power is no longer based upon wide and major agreement between religious or political elite of the Islamic community. No, it is now primarily, if not only based upon the ability to have power, control it, and use it. The second key consequence that emerges out of that huge event in Islamic history is a signal also to anyone interested in becoming the caliph, the political successor to the Prophet at the time, that it is no longer about your precedence to embracing Islam, as was the case, effectively, from the death of the Prophet Muhammad. It is no longer about the services rendered to the spread of Islam. It is no longer about your position, how people revere your position within the Islamic community, and how different groups, especially of the early believers, early adopters of Islam, early embracers of Islam, how they see you and your position within that community. No, all of that is no longer particularly important. It is primarily about your ability again to control power and the resources of power and to deploy it. That was a second key message and signal sent to effectively all the major communities of Muslims. And the message was heard. The message was received. Why? Because of the dramatic use of power in Karbala and the painful way in which Al-Hussein and members of the household of the Prophet were killed, so that Al-Umayyun, the Umayyads, secure decisively their rule. The fourth key message that also appears and becomes very clear out of the death of Al-Hussein and the transfer of power is very much purely political, as in, for 20 years or so before Karbala, before the killing of Al-Hussein, effectively from the time of Ali ibn Abi Talib, the fourth political successor to the Prophet and his cousin, Islam started to, or the political notion of the state within Islam started to be diluted. Before that, for roughly 3-4 decades from the death of the Prophet Muhammad, Islam was growing, was spreading. There were the Islamic conquests. Basically, the armies that emerged out of the Arabian Peninsula secured and controlled Iran, Persia, the entirety of today's Iraq, today's Syria, the entire Eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, which was incredibly rich, at least at the time, and the beginning of Al-Maghrib, the beginning of North Africa, what's today Libya and Tunisia. And it was even starting to spread beyond that. But basically, 20, 30, 40 years of huge expansion. The center was still in the Arabian Peninsula, but it was very simple political structure. For the 20 years or so, from the third, fourth decade afterwards, there were political turbulences, which meant that the center that was in the Arabian Peninsula started to be weakened, especially that now political forces were in Iraq. Ali ibn Abi Talib himself was based in Iraq, but other challengers, including the Umayyads, this very wealthy Arabian clan, which played an important role in securing the Levant, especially Syria, for Islam, was also starting to challenge rulership of or within Islam. Long story short, in order not to get bogged down in details, the concentration of power that was in the Arabian Peninsula in the first 30, 40 years was lost. You had dilution of power, a number of centers, of political centers, that began to appear roughly from the year 35, 40 until 55, 60. Here, with the decisive transfer of power to the Umayyads, who were based in Damascus, that dilution is very much ending, very much returning to a center, single center, concentration of power in Damascus. A fifth consequence out of the Umayyads' concentration of power is that geographic shift. Islam, as we discussed before, politically very much centered in the Arabian Peninsula. In the 20 years or so from the year 35, 40, from the death of the Prophet, or from, anyway, to 55, 60, you have a number of centers, but still very much in the Arabian Peninsula and Iraq. Now we see a geographic shift to the Eastern Mediterranean, to Syria, to Damascus, which basically means that you have the center of gravity of politics in the nascent Islamic State and Islamic Empire, moving from the desert culture of the Arabian Peninsula at the time, and also from the military camps culture of Iraq at the time, towards a very established urban center, which is Damascus at the time. Why Damascus was very different from Iraq of the time and the Arabian Peninsula of the time? Because Damascus, for hundreds of years before that, was an urban center, was a very important city within the Byzantine Empire. So long story short, not just elements of the nature of power and securing legitimacy changed, but also the geographic shift within the Islamic State at the time, within the nascent Islamic Empire of the time, meant a change in the mindset as you move from the Arabian Peninsula, as you move from military camps towards a very old urban center of an old civilization, which is the Byzantine here, which is Damascus. That shift also resulted in political, economic changes within the state, within the nascent empire. For example, in the nature of the economy. Before the shift to Damascus, to the Levant, the state of the political state in Islam, primarily in the Arabian Peninsula, was very much based upon the khiraj, that is the economic extraction, the economic levy, tax, if you'd like, that each province in the Islamic State, in the Islamic Empire, was sending to the center in the Arabian Peninsula. But that was very much basically, you can think of it from a financial point of view. How much money could that province provide to the treasury in the Arabian Peninsula? The more the Islamic State, the Islamic Empire now transferred to the Levant, to Damascus, more concentration happened in politics, the more you had the center, the Umayyad state, thinking of these provinces as contributors to a larger economy, meaning it was no longer about how much each state can send to me at the center in terms of financial contribution. No, it became more of what is the economic nature of that province versus that province, and how can I expand the pie as a whole bigger. A long story short, that meant that the view of the center changed towards each of the provinces. As a consequence of that, the economy of the Islamic State, of the Islamic Empire, as it was growing as well as settling in its place, began to change. Related to that is another political economic change, which is in also the nature of the economic sectors contributing to the state, to the empire. Meaning, the major groups that spread Islam out of the Arabian Peninsula into all of these provinces were very much, when they were not fighters, traders, which was the nature of the Arabian economy in the Arabian Peninsula, before Islam and in the first few decades of Islam. But now that the state, the center of the empire, was in the Levant, and now that that established, entrenched center began to economically view the provinces differently, and also as the elite themselves started to change from the elite that was in the Arabian Peninsula, the elite that was close to Ali ibn Abi Talib in Iraq, to a different elite that was close to the Umayyads, al-Umayyun, in the Levant and particularly around Damascus. All of that meant that the notion of trading, land caravan-based trading, as the primary sole way of building the economy within Islam and wealth within the elite began to be diluted. And instead, the notion of different economic sectors, agriculture, which was huge in the Levant and in Egypt, began to gain prominence, which meant that the notion of wealth, the channels of wealth, and also meaning of how one becomes in the elite of that state, of that empire, all of that began to change. Add to that as well that the notion of elite, of how to become in the upper classes in that state, in that empire, not only changed because of this change in the economy and the sources of wealth, and also not only changed because of the geographic change, move from the Arabian Peninsula, from Iraq to the Eastern Mediterranean, Syria, Damascus. In addition to all of that, there was a change of how the elite, of how the upper classes of the state, of the empire, shifted because of the dynastic nature that now was the way, the form of rule within Islam. Why? Because as long as initially the rulership, the caliphate, the political succession to the Prophet was based upon precedence, was based upon contribution to the spread of Islam, services rendered to the state in its early decades, but primarily through major, wide agreement within the political and religious class, which was the same at the time, as all of that now shifted to dynastic rule of one family in a very established urban society, Damascus, and the economy is changing. All of that meant that now to become an elite was no longer based upon the history of what you did before, no longer based upon where you came from within the early Islamic community. It was primarily about, from a political point of view, how close you are to the new court, to the new ruling establishment surrounding the Umayyads in the new capital, Damascus. Another very important element that also began to appear at the time is a demographic element. The Islamic communities began to get out of the Arabian Peninsula and settle into the different provinces very early on, from basically the second decade of or after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, which was the second and third decade in which Islam really started to establish the beginning of its empire, the conquests, really securing Iran, Iraq, effectively the entire Eastern Mediterranean, Egypt, the beginning of moving towards Tunisia. Groups started to settle down, whether as the rulers or as groups surrounding them who were warriors, who were the conquistadors, if you'd like, who conquered these countries and began to settle there. But at least for 20, 30 years, the settling of the early warriors or warrior communities in these different lands was detached from the societies. And that's very clear when you look at how the early urban centers or small cities of these armies were always at the very end, at the margins of the earlier cities of these places. But as time went by, and more importantly, as the nature of the economy of the Islamic State the nascent Islamic empire began to change. And as even the composition of the elite of that state began to change, a merge, slow merge, began to happen in all of these different lands between the migrant groups, the elite migrant Arab groups that came from the Arabian Peninsula and settled in these different parts, different lands, with the native groups and communities of those lands. If you fast forward 30, 40 years, you start to see almost total merge, and therefore roughly 100 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, or even less than that, maybe 70, 80 years after that, you start to see erosion, even disappearance of the lines that separated the warrior communities that came and settled in these lands and the native groups. More or less, you start to see one group, many intermarriages and trading links and what have you, and you end up with not just a new political structure, dynastic, not just new ways of securing the rule, not just new elements of the economy, but also new blurring of the lines in the demographics of that state, that empire. With all of that, there is also a cultural dimension, change, which is naturally the Arab Muslims who came out of the Arabian Peninsula had very limited exposures to all of these wonderful civilizations in which they conquered and entered their lands, whether the Persian civilization or the Byzantine part of the Levant or Egypt at the time. But quickly they started to interact with all of that. However, the very first interaction was with the Persian civilization, because Islam very quickly acquired or conquered Iraq, which at the time was, at least the eastern part of it, very much under the control of the Sassanid dynasty, an Iranian dynasty. But what happened there is that the Sassanid Empire, effectively, the Persian Empire, collapsed totally. So Islam took the lands, not just parts of the land of the Sassanids, it effectively took the entirety of the empire. Naturally, many of the elite groups of that Persian Sassanid Empire left. Actually, many of them went to India. What matters here is that it was a shock within the Iranian culture, within the Iranian civilization, that these groups of nomads, basically coming from a very poor part of the world, and certainly culturally far below the Iranian civilization, managed not just to take the lands, but even to effectively collapse the entire empire. That meant that for a number of years, arguably 20, 30 years at least, the interaction between the Muslim or Islamic or Arab communities that entered Iran, Persia of the time, and Iraq with the cultural elite, the civilizational reminiscences of the Persian Empire was quite limited. But when Islam went west and secured and conquered the eastern Mediterranean and Egypt, the rulership of that land, which was the Byzantine Empire, did not collapse. It lost those lands, but the empire itself, which was in Constantinople, today's Istanbul, did not collapse, continued to be there. Yes, a number of the elite of the Byzantines who were in the Eastern Mediterranean or in Egypt left when Islam entered, but primarily the people of the land themselves who were occupied by the Byzantines did not leave, they stayed. The important point here is that the cultural interaction between the Arab Muslim communities that entered the Eastern Mediterranean and Egypt at the time was much faster and smoother, with the reminiscences, with the flourishings, the wonderful things that were cultural things, artistic things, scientific things that were in these lands, was much smoother, faster, quicker, integrative than was the case in Iran in the first few decades when Islam entered. Why this is important? Because as Islam politically was in parts of Iraq and parts of Iran, the nature of politics was very much detached from what was there culturally before. But in the Eastern Mediterranean, the nature of politics, as it began to be entrenched under the Umayyads, al-Umayyin, in Damascus, was very quickly able to integrate what was there before from the Byzantines, was very quickly able to learn culturally and artistically and architecturally and of course politically, bureaucratically, of the structures of the state that was there before Islam enters. Again, why? Because while in the case of Iran there was the shock of the fall, the crumbling of the entire civilization, state primarily, empire, of the Sassanids when the Muslims entered, that was not the case in the Levant. And therefore the interaction was easier, because the shock was much, much easier, and because the people who were there to interact with the Muslims were not necessarily the owners of that Byzantine Empire. They were also more or less occupied by the Romans of Constantinople. The point I'm trying to convey here is that the Umayyad state, with all of the political and economic and demographic changes that were taking place at the time, were also able to integrate relatively quickly a lot of what was there before from the Byzantines, as opposed to how it was before in Iraq and parts of Iran in the couple of decades before. When you take all of these points together, you can argue, I think, that the decisive victory of the Umayyads and turning the state into hereditary, based on a family, dramatically changing the rule, the nature of ruling, the legitimacy of ruling, and the major political, economic, and demographic changes, all of that effectively made that transfer of power after Karbala, after Ashura, entrenching the power of the Umayyads, the first dynasty of Islam, a decisive moment in the growth of the Islamic State and the empire of Islam. Many people will debate the pluses and the minuses from a political and political economic point of view. But the point I want to draw attention to is the link to the very first element or point I mentioned, which is the painful memory, the hugely painful memory of the killing of Al-Hussein and members of the household of the Prophet, which led to all of these political changes. Here you have a separation between the political development of the state, the Islamic Empire, as I have tried to elaborate, with a change in the soul of politics in Islam by the death of Al-Hussein and the members of the Prophet, house of the Prophet, after Karbala. You can think of it, at least imagine it, as there was a certain drive, spiritual drive, certain elements of the soul, if you'd like, that continued in the first 40, 50, 60 years in the momentum of the spread of Islam politically, as it was centered around precedents in Islam, around services rendered, and of course around the number of people who were very close to the Prophet Muhammad, and who is closer also than Ali ibn Abi Talib, his cousin, one of the very, very early embraces of Islam, and his son Al-Hussein. When all of that was not only marginalized but slaughtered in Karbala, that meant that intangible flow was completely driven out of the momentum of politics in the Islamic State, in the Islamic Empire, and it was more or less lost. On the other side, there was the entrenchment of the state, of the empire, on the new political and political economy foundations that I have tried to elaborate upon. That separation, I think, is very important to reflect upon.